Hello, and welcome to this session about prevention versus detection and response. Before we get started, I want to introduce myself. My name is Ben Haim. I'm a certified CISSP and a CISO, and today I serve as an SC at Minerva Labs. Let's start by talking about the growing problem. As security professionals, we all know that we spend more and more money on security solutions every year. Every year we hear about new technologies and new ways of preventing cyber attacks. However, it seems that even though we're spending more and more money, the problem isn't going away. In fact, according to IBM, things are only getting worse by the year. And by last year, 2021, we spent an average of 287 days detecting and containing a breach. Another piece of harsh reality is that every second we see 22 new unique malwares worldwide, and the average time to contain a suspicious file is 14 minutes. 90% of these malwares are evasive malwares. An evasive malware, by definition, is a malware that is trying to avoid detection. We'll see examples of that as we move forward. Time is a very important thing in cybersecurity, not just when we talk about the spread of new malwares every day and every hour, but also once the machine is infected. Here we can see a table of the top 10 ransomware families that we have seen in the last few years. This is an experiment done by Splunk just recently. We can see the time it took for these ransomwares to encrypt files. Splunk took samples of these ransomware families and ran them in different environments. Each environment had 100,000 files that weigh nearly 53 gigabytes. We can see that the top 5 were able to encrypt these in less than a half an hour. Another interesting finding was that Lockbit encrypts only 4 kilobytes of data from each file, which means, of course, it doesn't have to encrypt the entire file in order to cause damage, which makes it very efficient and very fast. Part of the problem is our next-gen antivirus. It's not to say that it's not doing a great job, because it is, at handling known threats. An antivirus is based on heuristics, behavior analysis, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. All of these required existing data to work with, which means that the bottom line is, in order to determine if an unknown file is malicious, it must first let it run. Another part of the problem are the EDR, XDR solutions that we have. Again, they do a great job. They help us understand what happens, they help us respond in real time, but they don't help us prevent anything before it happens. And for the same reason that the next-gen antivirus doesn't help us understand. In fact, if you really think about it, they're quite similar. EDR collects logs, aggregates data, and looks at behavior and heuristics. And for an EDR, it takes more than one red flag to actually meet a certain threshold to even say to the SOC analyst, there could be a problem here. So again, it brings us to the same bottom line. In order to determine if an unknown application is malicious, it must first let it run. So how do we bridge that gap? The gap between unknown and known malware. The gap between we don't want something to run on our endpoint, yet we need to know what it is and we need to stop it. We can use malware's own evasive technique against it, much like in the art of Aikido, the Japanese martial art, where we use the opponent's strength against them. We can create a new formula, a new equation. The harder they try, the harder they fall. If we start looking at the evasion techniques, rather than the malicious payload itself, we can create a new formula in which the more evasive a malware would be, the easier it will be for us to detect it. Let's look at the flow of the attack. If we look at the classic Lockheed Martin kill chain, we know that the first 2 stages are completely out of our reach. We can't stop passive reconnaissance and we can't stop weaponization. What we can stop is delivery, sometimes, but we definitely have something to do when it gets to exploitation. The Mitra framework is similar, though it's a little different. The malicious actor doesn't have to check all these boxes here. But initial access and execution are a must. If we start looking at evasive techniques, we can stop these attacks before they get to these stages. Let's try to look at the kill chain from a different perspective. On the left-hand side, we have the point of entry, and on the right, the crown jewels of the organization. Once a malicious actor is trying to penetrate the organization, he won't be able to get to these crown jewels right away. There are a few stops he needs to make on his way. First one being, of course, the initial access. Now, there are a few ways to stop initial access, or at least to mitigate the chance of an initial access occurring. We could make it very hard for a drive-by download attack to work. We can filter email to combat social engineering. But even then, experiments have shown that it's impossible to train all your employees to not click on malicious links and to not fall victims to social engineering attacks. Also, there's not much we can do about software upgrades, as we will see later on in the SUNBURST attack. Once initial access was gained, the attacker is going to try to figure out where he is, and is going to try to avoid detection. He will do so using evasive techniques. The next step will be preparation. Whether it's lateral movement, positioning his pieces in all the right places, privilege escalation to make sure he can get to where he needs to go, and to establish outside communication for command and control. Only then will the malicious payload be executed, and that is exactly when detection and response can begin. Which means that the point of no return is right here. And if we want to prevent the attack before the malicious payload is executed, this is our window. And we can do that by leveraging the evasive techniques against the malicious actor. If we keep relying on detection and response, we'll have to wait for the malicious payload to begin execution. Let's look at two scenarios. Today we have detection first. Detection first starts with an unknown file that is allowed to run. No other way to know if it's malicious or not. Once a few malicious actions were already taking place, the EDR will eventually raise a flag. The incident is detected, and we can begin to respond. We can now generate those signatures and behavior analytics that we can rely on in our investigation in order to generate an update for the next attack. By that time, of course, it's a known attack. In the second scenario, prevention first, an unknown file can begin to run, but only enough to show its evasive techniques. Once it has shown one evasive technique, it can be blocked right away. Of course, we can still generate an alert, and we can still perform the investigation, but no harm was done to the endpoint, as opposed to the previous scenario where the three first stages guarantee that something has happened to the endpoint. And of course, we should always learn our lesson even when we can stop the malware or even when no damage was done. Let's look at some use cases. The first one is a CERBER ransomware, which uses something called selective targeting. The flow is actually quite simple. Victim receives and opens a Word document. Victim runs the macro, which serves, of course, as a dropper, runs the PowerShell script, downloads the malicious ransomware. The malicious ransomware is written to the disk, and then it begins to execute. It creates persistency. It's starting to run using WMI, and eventually encrypts the computer and asks for ransom. But we should zoom in on one particular stage. Before the PowerShell began to execute the ransomware, it actually asked one very particular question. It wanted to know which languages are being used on the endpoint. It wanted to know the endpoint that it's about to attack. or in other words, which endpoints to avoid. If the answer was yes to any of these questions, then it would terminate the process immediately. That is by definition an evasive technique. A more famous example is the SUNBURST backdoor, better known as the SolarWinds attack 2 years ago. So what happened there is that the supply chain was attacked. The code itself was changed and then sent to SolarWinds users. And here again the attack started to unfold. It used a completely unknown tool to get a hold of these particular endpoints. Of course, once it had the grip, it served as a spyware. It was collecting information about all these different endpoints. And even though this wasn't ransomware, this is stage 7 of the cyber kill chain. But again, let's take a step back. Before the malicious process began, the SUNBURST backdoor wanted to know if it's on a sandbox environment or not. It began looking for different processes on the endpoint: autoruns, sysmon, regmon, TCP dump, and others. It wanted to avoid a sandbox. If the answer was yes to any of these questions, then again, the malware would terminate. Another classic case of evasive technique. In conclusion, we as cybersecurity professionals must stay one step ahead of evasive malwares. They're here today and they're here to stay. Second, we should focus on prevention rather than detection and response. This is the best way to protect our environment and our organization. The cat and mouse game has to end. We can't keep chasing signatures. We need to have a better view of what's going on and how to stop it before it happens. We can do that because we know with high certainty that a malware is a malware before it starts delivering that malicious payload. We don't need to wait for the malicious payload to run in order to know that we're dealing with the malware. And again, we can change the paradigm. We can force the malware to become an antivirus, much like it's hard for an antivirus to know if it's dealing with the malware or not. We should create a situation where the malware doesn't know what it's dealing with when it gets to our endpoint. Let the malware jump through hoops trying to understand what is going on. The bottom line is a great phrase by a Dutch philosopher: prevention is better than cure. Thank you so much for listening.